What's up, everybody? Welcome back to U.S. History class. Okay, now we're getting into the 1960s. Yesterday and recently here, we've been kind of hitting the 1950s. For the most part, the 1950s, the world is still catching its breath and the dust is still settling from World War II. Things are kind of getting back to normal. In a lot of ways, I would compare the 1950s to like the Roaring 20s. Kind of a consistently, generally good time for most people. There's a lot of problems underneath the surface, tensions with the communist world or civil rights issues going on. But overall, like it was kind of like a good decade for the majority of Americans. Everything hits the fan in the 1960s. The 60s are a crazy decade, probably the wildest decade in American history. At least that's the subjective Chaluki opinion. So in your notes, if you are taking notes for the Cold War and civil rights, I said to have 2 pages of notes going. I think at this point, I would draw a line on both of those notes pages, wherever you're at, and then put a heading in there for each page that says like the 1960s. Now, the stuff I'm covering today in this chunk of notes really could go on to either of those pages. I would probably add this stuff to the civil rights page, but honestly, it doesn't matter. I'd recommend you do take some notes on this stuff, as some of the things I'm covering today will for sure be on upcoming quizzes and eventually on the exam. As long as you have it accounted for somewhere in your notes, you should be good to go. But again, like I'm talking about kind of broad things like a political election and a president. So that'll kind of influence or tie into both of those separate notes pages. Now, if you asked me at the beginning of the year or end of the year, whenever, like Chaluki, what's your favorite topic to cover? It would probably be World War I or World War II. I like both of those conflicts. I find them fascinating. Probably my favorite like single topics, and you'd probably guess that from how much time I spent on those conflicts. But if you ask me what's the most interesting decade or time chunk to cover in class, I think hands down I would say the 1960s are like my favorite era, where I'm just very fascinated by it. So we are going to spend quite a bit of time in the 60s because it is a revolutionary time where there is a lot of upheaval. A lot of things happen in the Cold War. A lot of things happen in the civil rights movement. So anyway, today we're going to kind of kick that off. So draw that line in your notes, whichever page you're going to add these to, put in a heading like 1960s or beginning, and buckle up, hold on, because it's a wild decade. So where I'm going to start with a kind of a logical thing would be the election of 1960. A presidential election comes up, and after 2 terms of President Eisenhower, who I had covered yesterday in some notes, he was a steady hand at the wheel. Everybody trusted him. People of both parties said he is like an honorable patriot that we trust against the communists. But he is termed out now since FDR had served 4 terms as president, or at least started his 4th term and then died early on in that one. Before that, it had just been tradition that most presidents had not served more than 2 terms, because that's what George Washington, our first president, had done. But it was never an ironclad rule, and FDR just kept running and getting elected. Now an amendment had been passed to the Constitution where presidents are term limited out after 2 terms in office. So Eisenhower's done whether he wanted to or not. I don't think he intended to run for another term, even if he could have. He was getting to be an older guy, and we're going to have some fresh faces coming in. 2 very, very recognizable politicians. I would hope that you guys have heard of these guys before this lecture that you're seeing on the screen. And actually, obviously, only one of them is going to win the election of 1960, but eventually both of them do become presidents. So let's start off with JFK, or John F. Kennedy. Very interesting politician. He's an interesting human being too, and I'm going to profile him a little bit more in depth down the road here. John F. Kennedy, or JFK, no, he's a Democrat. That's why I put his colors in the blue there, because typically, like in modern politics, you'll hear of red states and blue states. A blue state is typically in modern American politics, it means a Democrat state, and a red state means a Republican one. So JFK, he is a Democrat, although Democrats of the 1960s wouldn't necessarily be a Democrat today. And I've heard a lot of people say, this is very debatable, that if Kennedy was around today with his same ideals and platform, he would more likely be actually a Republican today. I don't know. Who knows on that? That's kind of a speculation type thing. But anyway, for Kennedy, he has kind of a unique appeal because he is very young. He is energetic, optimistic. He's a good-looking guy, too. I don't know if you get it from the picture I have on the screen right there, but I'll show more images of him down the road. Now, go look at the list of like 6, 7, 8 presidents, all the ones we've covered in the early 1900s. What did most of those guys look like? Well, most of them were old, gray-haired, kind of stuffy or bald white guys that looked like a grandpa or something. Kennedy didn't look like that. He was in his 40s. The only president we've ever had that was younger than him was Teddy Roosevelt, and Roosevelt actually didn't get elected when he became president. Remember, there was an assassination, and he was vice president and slid in. So Roosevelt is still to this day the youngest president we had ever had, but Kennedy is the youngest president to get elected in his own right. So it's a breath of fresh air. Americans are not used to having a young, charismatic guy in his 40s that's kind of tan and has a good head of hair, and he has young kids. When he ends up winning this election, it'll be the first time in like over a generation that there are little kids. The first time since Teddy Roosevelt, actually, that there are little kids like in the White House running around playing. So that's kind of different and part of his appeal. I think America was ready to shake things up. In the 60s, things are getting to like kind of a bubbling point, and a lot of people want to, because Eisenhower was a Republican. So we had had 2 terms of a Republican president. And usually in American politics, things kind of swing back and forth from one side to the other. So America at this time was trending kind of away from the Republican Party and more towards the Democratic Party. However, it ends up being a super close election, probably, maybe debatably like the most close presidential election in American history. Anyway, JFK's platform, to sum it up for you, like what he is campaigning on, he makes a big push that, hey, it's time to do something with like civil rights reforms. That is increasingly becoming a big issue. Martin Luther King, remember, he leads the Montgomery bus boycott in like 1957, 58. He does some more protests in the late 1950s. That is starting to increasingly become like front and center on Americans' minds, where that we're confronting those issues of race and segregation and the oppression of the Black community. So Kennedy really tries to appeal to the Black community. He says, I'm going to push for more civil rights reforms. And he is able to gain a lot of Black support. Now, remember, the Black community is about 15% of the whole electorate back in this time. White America is like 75, 80%. So you're not going to get elected by even winning all the Black votes. You're going to have to win a lot of whites too. Well, Kennedy also very much appealed to a lot of white America. He comes from a political family that had been in politics. His dad had been a senator and an ambassador. So it's kind of a well-known name, the Kennedy brand. Anyway, his weak spot is that he is a younger guy. He was a World War II veteran, but he's a lot of his detractors or his political opponents will say he's not going to be tough enough to stand up against the Soviet Union, the Russians. He's not going to be able to go battle communism on the world stage. So I think his strong suit was people like trusted him with civil rights reform, and they thought maybe he's moving in the right direction there. People had questions about how he would deal with the communist world and like our policies like containment. Now, his opponent is Richard Nixon, the Republican. Nixon was actually Eisenhower's vice president. So he is a very well-known guy too. He's also a World War II veteran. He's in a lot of ways kind of almost the polar opposite of Kennedy. He is more, if you were voting for Nixon, you were voting for the status quo. That means kind of keeping things the same. His pledge was, hey, Eisenhower was a steady hand at the wheel. He was a trusted general. He was tough on communism. If you liked what Eisenhower was doing, vote for Nixon. It'll be essentially more of the same, a new face, but similar policies. Nixon, and he kind of gets a bad rap in a lot of ways for how he ends up leaving the office when he gets elected to president years away. And he's the only president in American history that ends up resigning in disgrace with a scandal. But of course, none of that, the Watergate scandal that we're going to cover down the road, that hadn't happened yet. So he is seen as a very trusted American politician who's been a face in Washington for quite a while. two big juggernauts. These are two very skilled politicians that are squaring off in this election, and America is just about evenly divided between the two guys. So a little bit more notes on the election of 1960. This is just, I couldn't fit it all on one slide, but I wanted to wrap it up here. It's an interesting election, and in a lot of ways, I think it's the first modern presidential election cycle in American history. What do I mean by that? Well, super close, but it's also that this is the first time there is a live televised debate, where now we kind of take that for granted. And it's become tradition in modern politics that the presidential candidates will have 3 debates. Back at this time, this was the first time this had ever happened, at least on TV, where America at large can watch this. Now, TVs are a new thing too. By the end of the 1950s, by the time you get to 1960, the vast majority of American homes have at least one television set in their house. It was definitely not like it is today, where you got a TV in every room and they're flat screens and stuff. There are these old black and white TVs, but now that has caught on like radios did a generation before. And people are increasingly fascinated by television and tuning in. And average family, I think by this time, was watching 4 or 5 hours of TV every night. It's a new toy in the house that America falls in love with. And this is the first time really politics is going to be covered on your television. Now, remember, there's no cable TV at this time. You don't have 100 stations or 1,000 stations. There was like 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. They're all still around today, but you basically had those 3 options. Anyway, this is the first time that all 3 of the networks are covering the presidential debate. So no matter what channel you put it on the dial, you were going to see this. So the vast majority of Americans do sit down in their living room and watch these two guys debate on TV. That's the first time that had happened. You know, before this, election cycles prior, it was like you would read about what the guys said in the newspaper, and you know, it wasn't super important. Like I said, a lot of the presidents prior to Kennedy had been old stuffy white guys that look like your grandpa, and a lot of them were not super charismatic public speakers. It didn't matter as much because you would read about what their policies were, and you wouldn't actually have to see them deliver a speech in person, or at least most people wouldn't. But now with television being a new thing, you're going to see the president quite a bit more, and he's going to have press conferences and stuff. So America, on the one hand, is debating whose policies are better. On the other hand, as soon as you add something like television into the mix, now people, there's that certain like charisma, that thing you can't put, a pen on and like exactly specify it, but it's like, which of these guys is just going to kind of psychologically appeal to more of the American public? Well, the story goes, and this is something that I'd want you to add into your notes that I don't have on the slide. So for those of you that are watching the notes, or watching the lecture and taking notes, I would account for this in some way. Make a point of this, just in your own words on there. People that had watched this, and they did polling afterwards, the vast majority of people that watched the debate on TV felt like Kennedy won the debate. And a part of that is just how he looked, that he was younger. He was probably a little bit better speaker and smoother on camera. I think he understood how important it was going to be for modern politicians to be camera friendly. And he also agreed to put on makeup and stuff, which you might think, well, that sounds girly. Why would a guy be putting makeup on, like back in that generation? Well, if you're on TV, all television anchors and people that are acting on shows and stuff, if you don't put on this certain makeup that you don't really even see, you look really kind of like almost glossy or glare. It makes you look sweaty and shiny. Nixon, who's a more old school guy that doesn't really, I don't think, get how important television's going to be at this point. He's like, I'm not putting on any makeup. Get away from me with those powders and stuff like that. And he just goes on just like right off the street. Now, he's well prepared for the debate, but I guess when they would do close-ups, and you can't really see it from the image I have here, when they would do a lot of close-ups, Nixon looked sweaty and clammy, and he often wasn't making eye contact with the camera, so people felt like he was looking away and being shifty, whereas Kennedy was really good and smooth on camera and looking right into it, and he had that makeup on, so he kind of looked more tan, looked healthier. Now, people that listen to the debate on the radio, because there's a lot of Americans that don't have a TV set yet, and many also listen to it just, the audio of it, overwhelmingly, people that listened to it on the radio felt like Nixon won the debate, that he actually made better points and was kind of more logical and seemed more organized and presidential. But people that watched it on TV, they overwhelmingly thought Kennedy won. He just had a better kind of curb appeal there on the screen. So Kennedy ends up winning this very, very close election. And it was one that, how it works in the American system, when you win a majority of votes in a state, you get all of that state's electoral votes. It basically came down to, there was a couple swing states that would have decided the election. The state of Illinois goes for Kennedy. If it had gone for Nixon, and it was like, it came down to literally like a couple hundred votes, that would have swung the election in favor of Nixon. But Kennedy ends up pulling it off. Now, a couple notable things about Kennedy as he's starting up his presidency. He pledged a lot of support to the civil rights movement. He came across as being sympathetic to the plight of the Black community and being kind of friendly with guys like Martin Luther King. So this is the first time this happens where he, as a Democrat, wins 70% of the Black vote. I underline that there. That's a key point for you, too. Now, today, if you follow modern American politics, you know that, typically in presidential election cycles, like over 90% of the Black vote in modern day goes to the Democratic Party. That was not the case, though, back in the 60s. Actually, traditionally, before 1960, the Black community overwhelmingly voted for Republicans. And why would that be? Well, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. The Republicans were seen as the party that freed the slaves. Where you go back to Civil War times, the party that was trying to keep slavery was the Democrats. That was the Southern Party. Now, the parties have inverted a few times, so that's not a clear-cut, perfect analogy. But this has happened multiple times in American history where the parties essentially kind of almost switch sides from conservative to liberal. That was kind of going on in this time, and Kennedy accelerated that. So I think the election cycle before, the Black vote had been about split 50-50 between Republican and Democrat. Then cycles before that, more Blacks had voted for the Republican candidates and less for the Democrats. Now, Kennedy is starting to shake up and change the Democratic Party. You also have, and I don't want to get too off on a tangent, but there are Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats are kind of the racist segregationists. But Kennedy is not a Southern Democrat. He's from Massachusetts. He's going to be kind of the face of the new Democratic Party that is going to move more in a left-wing kind of liberal direction. And that appeals to the Black community. Once he's in office, now here, a lot of people felt like, and were critical of him after he got elected, especially a lot of the Black community, guys like Martin Luther King. They said, hey, you made all these promises that you're going to push civil rights reforms. But once he became president, he was kind of reluctant to do that for the reason I just mentioned. Because he had a lot of the Southern white Democrats that had voted for him and helped him get elected to office. But he was worried, and I think he was probably right to be concerned about this politically, if he pushed the civil rights reforms too much and he was really for integration and getting rid of all the segregation policies, there's a good chance in the next election cycle in 1964 that a lot of those white Southern Democrats wouldn't have voted for him and he might have lost the election. Now, of course, he doesn't get a chance to run for re-election because Kennedy very famously gets assassinated and it's caught on video and everything. We'll be covering that in the near future, but a lot of stuff happens in his 3 years as president. So we're probably a week or two off from covering the assassination. Anyway, he is thinking ahead. He doesn't realize that that's going to happen. So he's thinking ahead to getting his second term. He becomes very reluctant for civil rights reforms because he wants to keep his whole coalition together. He wants to keep the Black community happy if possible, and he wants to keep those white Southern Democrats happy. Now, what he does do for the civil rights movement, and this was kind of a controversial thing, he appointed his younger brother, Bobby Kennedy, to be the Attorney General of the United States, like the top lawman, the top federal prosecutor. Well, different Supreme Court cases had come down and had gotten rid of things like segregated schools, separate but equals gone. And they had gotten rid of kind of Rosa Parks having to sit in the back of the bus. Bus segregation had been struck down. There were quite a few Supreme Court cases that had ended a lot of these segregation policies down in the southern states. But a lot of the southern mayors and governors were saying, screw that. We don't care what the Supreme Court says in D.C. We're still going to keep things segregated. Well, Bobby Kennedy comes in, and as using kind of the power of the office of the presidency and being the attorney general, he goes and files a bunch of lawsuits down in southern states and basically forces southern states to comply with these new Supreme Court decisions that are integrating society. So that's kind of unpopular with many whites in the South. A lot of people also feel like, hey, it's long overdue for that. It's time that they start getting on board and coming into the modern world and getting rid of those segregationist ideas. Anyway, in a lot of ways, Bobby Kennedy, the president's younger brother, probably did more in that 3-year chunk of time where Kennedy was president to like further and push the civil rights movement than JFK actually did himself. Bobby Kennedy becomes hugely popular with the Black community. He was good friends and had a good relationships with guys like Martin Luther King. So we're going to cover him a little bit more down the road too, because he becomes a presidential contender years down the road. So stay tuned. Both the Kennedys we're going to be talking about a little bit more. So JFK, the other thing that he does that kind of boosts the civil rights movement a little bit is he was one of the first presidents to start appointing a lot of Black guys and qualified Black guys to federal jobs and federal positions. The president is the head of the executive branch. He has to fill his cabinet, but then the president or people functioning on his behalf, they appoint judges all over the country. They appoint all kinds of different federal positions and heads of agencies. So he is one of the first presidents to be open to that. And he starts including like Black politicians and lawyers into the political process. All right, that's all I got for you today. If you got any questions about the election or the early days of the Kennedy presidency, by all means, reach out to me and I'll be happy to chat with you more about it.